December 15, 1944. The mess hall of Camp Swift POW facility in Bastrop County, Texas, fell silent as 47 German women prisoners watched American guards carry in large metal serving containers. Steam rose from the vessels, carrying an aroma that seemed impossible in wartime. Butter, cheese, rich, creamy abundance that contradicted everything these women had been told about American deprivation and suffering under the weight of global war. Irmgard Richter sat at the long wooden table, her back straight despite exhaustion from weeks of transport across the Atlantic. At 24, she had served as a signals officer in the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, proud of her technical expertise and dedication to what she believed was her country's defense. Now, wearing a faded gray uniform with her insignia removed, she watched warily as American soldiers began ladling something golden and steaming into tin bowls before each prisoner. The woman beside her, Brunhilde Schneider, a 22-year-old auxiliary nurse from Nuremberg, leaned forward slightly to peer at the substance being served. Her medical training had taught her to observe carefully, to notice details others might miss. What she saw in that bowl defied her understanding of prison rations, of wartime scarcity, of everything she thought she knew about how captives were meant to suffer. Across the table, 19-year-old Adelheid Fischer clutched her tin cup with both hands, as if the simple object might anchor her to reality. She had been a typist in Leipzig, proud of her quick fingers and accuracy, believing she contributed to Germany's war effort through her administrative precision. Now she stared at the bowl, placed before her with an expression somewhere between hunger and suspicion. The substance in the bowls was unlike anything they had seen in years. Pasta tubes coated in a sauce so rich and golden it seemed to glow in the harsh light of the mess hall. Cheese, real cheese, not the ersatz substitutes they had grown accustomed to in Germany. Butter that hadn't been stretched with other fats or rationed to thin smears on hard bread. This was food from another world, from a country that clearly had not been suffering the deprivations they had been told about in propaganda broadcasts. An American guard, a young man with a Texas drawl and sun-weathered skin, noticed their hesitation. "It's mac and cheese," he said slowly, as if speaking to children. "Macaroni and cheese. Go on, it's safe to eat." His voice carried neither cruelty nor mockery, just a matter-of-fact friendliness that was itself unsettling to women who had been prepared for hatred from their captors. Irmgard picked up her spoon with careful deliberation. Around her, other women did the same, moving in near unison, as if their military training still governed their actions. The first bite was a revelation. Creamy, rich, warm, the cheese was real, the pasta soft, the whole dish so abundant in fats and flavor that it seemed obscene. Several women's eyes filled with tears, though whether from the taste itself or from the realization of how long they had been without such food, no one could say. 3 weeks earlier, on November 23, 1944, Irmgard Richter had stood on the deck of a converted transport ship, watching the American coastline emerge from the morning fog. She had been captured in France during the German retreat, swept up with other Women's Auxiliary Corps members as Allied forces advanced. The crossing had been rough, the accommodations cramped, but surprisingly humane. No one had struck them, no one had starved them. These facts troubled her more than any cruelty might have, because they contradicted every certainty she had built her adult life upon. Brunhilde Schneider stood beside her at the railing, her nurse's instinct making her count the women around them. 47 in total, ranging from 18 to 35 years old. Radio operators, nurses, clerks, telephone, switchboard operators. Women who had believed they were serving in defensive roles, keeping Germany safe from Allied aggression. Now they were being transported deep into enemy territory, to a place called Texas that existed in their minds only as a vague concept from American Western films they had seen before the war. The bus ride from the port had taken hours, carrying them through landscape that seemed impossibly vast and untouched by conflict. No bombed buildings, no rubble-filled streets, no desperate civilians scavenging for food or fuel. Instead, they saw farms with fat cattle grazing in fields, towns with intact houses and shops, cars moving freely on roads that hadn't been torn apart by tank treads or artillery strikes. Adelheid Fischer pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been told about America's suffering under the burden of war. When they finally arrived at Camp Swift, the November sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the compound. The facility was smaller than the massive POW camps they had heard about, clearly designed for a limited number of prisoners. Barracks buildings stood in neat rows, surrounded by wire fencing that seemed almost decorative compared to the fortifications they had seen in military installations back home. Guard towers stood at intervals, but the soldiers manning them looked young, almost boyish, nothing like the hardened warriors they had expected. Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female officers assigned to the facility, stood waiting as they disembarked from the buses. She was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and an expression that was firm but not unkind. She spoke in clear, measured English that Irmgard could partially understand from her school studies, though the accent was different from what her teachers had used. The processing took hours, names recorded, belongings cataloged, medical examinations conducted with surprising gentleness by American medical staff. Brunhilde noticed how the American nurses worked with efficiency and care, treating them as patients rather than enemies. It was disorienting, this absence of hostility. They had been prepared for hatred, for revenge, for the kind of treatment they had been told Americans showed to all Germans. Instead, they encountered bureaucratic thoroughness, mixed with an almost casual kindness that left them confused and uncertain. The barracks assigned to the German women were basic but clean, with rows of metal cots covered in wool blankets that smelled faintly of soap and sunlight. Irmgard chose a bunk near the window, methodically arranging her few permitted possessions on the small shelf beside it. A photograph of her family in Frankfurt, taken before the war when her father still smiled easily. A small leather notebook that had survived the journey, its pages mostly blank but precious for that very reason. A wooden comb her mother had given her when she joined the Auxiliary Corps, carved with tiny flowers along the handle. Around her, the other women were settling in with varying degrees of composure. Some maintained rigid military bearing, unpacking with precise movements, as if they were still in training barracks back home. Others moved slowly, almost mechanically, their faces showing the exhaustion of weeks of uncertainty and fear. A few younger women were crying quietly, trying to hide their tears from the others. Brunhilde moved through the barracks like she moved through hospital wards, her nurses' training making her notice who seemed ill, who was struggling, who needed attention or support. She paused beside a young woman named Gerda, who was shaking badly despite the relative warmth of the room. Shock, Brunhilde diagnosed silently. The girl couldn't be more than 19, probably had never been outside her home region before joining the Auxiliary Corps, and now found herself thousands of miles from everything familiar. The door opened, and 3 American guards entered, causing immediate tension throughout the room. The women turned to face them with wary expressions, some standing at attention from pure habit, but the guards were young, perhaps early 20s, and they carried their rifles casually rather than in any threatening posture. One of them, a lanky man with reddish hair and freckles across his sunburned nose, smiled awkwardly. "Evening, ladies," he said in heavily accented German that was clearly learned from a phrase book. "Guten Abend, I'm Corporal Jake Morrison. This here's Private Chen and Private Williams. We're assigned to your section." He gestured to his companions, a slim Asian-American man and a stocky soldier with dark skin. The presence of non-white soldiers in positions of authority was itself surprising to women who had been taught about American racial hierarchies and conflict. Jake continued in English, speaking slowly and using hand gestures. Lights out is at 2200 hours. That's 10 o'clock. Breakfast at 0600, 6 in the morning. Latrine facilities are in the building next door. Any questions? He looked around hopefully, clearly wanting to be helpful despite the language barrier. Adelheid surprised herself by raising her hand slightly. Her English was basic, but perhaps better than most. Water? She asked. For drinking? Oh, sure, Jake said, his face brightening at the communication success. There's a pump right outside, and we'll bring pitchers to the mess hall with meals. Water's safe to drink straight from the tap. He paused, then added, Welcome to Texas, I guess. I know this ain't easy for y'all. The first morning brought a breakfast that aligned more closely with the women's expectations of prison life. Thin oatmeal, hard bread, weak coffee made from what tasted like mostly chicory and grain substitutes. Irmgard ate methodically, her signals training having taught her to fuel her body regardless of food quality. Around her, the 47 women sat in tense silence at the long mess hall tables, maintaining the discipline they had learned in their military service. The portions were adequate, perhaps even slightly generous by the standards they had grown accustomed to in Germany during the final years of the war. Brunhilde found herself thinking about the hospital where she had worked in Nuremberg, where rations for staff had dwindled month by month, until they were surviving on turnip soup and bread that was more sawdust than flour. This American prison breakfast, humble as it was, contained more real grain than she had seen in some weeks back home. Captain Mitchell stood at the front of the mess hall, waiting until the women had finished eating before addressing them through a translator, an older German-American civilian named Mrs. Hoffman, who spoke with a thick Bavarian accent that sounded achingly familiar to many of the prisoners. The captain explained the camp routine with business-like efficiency. Work assignments would begin the following week. The women would be expected to maintain their barracks, assist with laundry and kitchen duties, and perform light manufacturing work that complied with Geneva Convention regulations for prisoner labor. You will be treated fairly and in accordance with international law, Captain Mitchell said, her voice firm but not harsh. We expect you to follow camp regulations and treat staff with respect. In return, you will receive adequate food, medical care, and housing. This is not a punishment facility. You are prisoners of war, not criminals. The distinction seemed important to her, though several of the German women exchanged skeptical glances at the translator's words. Lunch brought more of the same: vegetable soup that was mostly broth with chunks of potato and carrot, more hard bread, an apple that was slightly bruised but fresh. Adelheid bit into the apple and was surprised by its sweetness, its juiciness. Fresh fruit had become a rarity in Germany long before she was captured. She ate it slowly, making each bite last, aware that this small pleasure might not be repeated. Dinner that first full day consisted of beans and rice with small pieces of pork mixed in, enough to flavor the dish but not enough to constitute a real portion of meat. It was filling without being satisfying, adequate without being generous. This was what they had expected. Prison rations that kept them alive without being comfortable, food that reminded them of their status as defeated enemies without quite descending into deliberate cruelty. Irmgard wrote in her notebook that night by the dim light near her bunk. The food is plain but sufficient, better than we had in the final months before capture. The Americans seem to follow rules about prisoners. Everything is organized, clean, proper. It feels strange to be treated according to regulations rather than with hatred. I do not trust it yet. On the third day, work assignments were posted on the barracks bulletin board. Brunhilde found her name listed for kitchen duty, which made sense given her medical background and presumed understanding of hygiene and cleanliness. She reported to the mess hall at 5 in the morning, when the Texas sky was still dark and stars hung bright above the compound. 2 other German women were assigned with her: Gerda, the young woman who had been shaking their first night, and an older prisoner named Margaret, who had worked in food service before joining the Auxiliary Corps. The kitchen was larger than Brunhilde had expected, with industrial stoves, huge sinks, and storage areas that seemed almost excessive for a camp housing fewer than 50 prisoners and perhaps 30 staff members. The head cook was a man in his 40s named Tommy Brennan, a former ranch cook who had been drafted into service managing POW facility kitchens. He had the weathered face of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to teaching inexperienced workers. Tommy didn't speak German, and Brunhilde's English was limited to a few dozen words, but he communicated through demonstration and repetition, his manner neither hostile nor overly friendly, simply practical. He showed them how to prepare oatmeal in the massive pots, how much coffee to measure out, how to slice bread from the large loaves that came from the camp bakery. The work itself was familiar. The rhythms of institutional cooking, not so different from the hospital kitchen she had known in Nuremberg. But then Tommy opened the storage room door, and Brunhilde stopped in her tracks. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with supplies that seemed impossible in wartime. Sacks of flour, white flour, not the gray ersatz mixture she had grown used to. Cans of vegetables, their labels bright and undamaged. Glass jars of preserved fruits. Most shocking of all, an entire shelf dedicated to different varieties of cheese, wheels, and blocks wrapped in cloth or wax, just sitting there as if dairy products weren't precious commodities to be rationed down to the ounce. Tommy noticed her stunned expression and smiled slightly. "Yeah, we got good supply lines here," he said, not understanding that his words were incomprehensible, but clearly reading her reaction. He picked up a can and gestured. "Tomatoes. Good stuff. Government contract." He set it down and picked up another. "Beans. Corn. Peaches." Each word was accompanied by the gesture of offering, as if he was trying to teach her English through grocery items. Gerda had moved closer, her eyes wide as she took in the abundance. She reached out tentatively to touch a sack of sugar, then pulled her hand back as if burned. In Germany, sugar had been rationed so severely that most people hadn't tasted real sweetness in years. Here it sat in 50-pound sacks, just one of many identical bags, stacked casually against the wall. Margaret spoke softly, in German, her voice carrying a note of something between wonder and resentment. "They have all of this, and we have been starving." December 15th arrived with the kind of cold morning that reminded the German women that even Texas experienced winter, though nothing like the brutal temperatures they had endured during their final months in Europe. Brunhilde had been working kitchen duty for 3 weeks by then, learning the rhythms of American institutional cooking and growing increasingly troubled by the sheer abundance of ingredients that flowed through the facility. Today, Tommy had shown her something new, pulling out boxes of dried pasta and blocks of bright orange cheese that seemed almost artificial in their vivid color. He had spent the morning teaching her a dish he called the ultimate comfort food, mixing butter and flour into a roux, adding milk until it became a creamy sauce, then stirring in handfuls of shredded cheese until the mixture became golden and smooth. The pasta had been boiled separately in huge pots of salted water, then drained and combined with the cheese sauce. The smell that filled the kitchen was intoxicating, rich with dairy fats and salt, the kind of aroma that seemed to belong to peacetime memories rather than wartime reality. When the lunch bell rang and the German women filed into the mess hall, they noticed immediately that something was different. The usual thin soup or plain beans were nowhere to be seen. Instead, Tommy and his crew, including Brunhilde and the other German kitchen workers, began bringing out large serving containers filled with the golden pasta mixture. Steam rose from the bowls as they were ladled out, each portion generous enough to constitute a full meal on its own. Irmgard stared at her bowl with an expression somewhere between disbelief and suspicion. The substance before her looked like something from a propaganda film about American excess, the kind of image that was meant to show capitalist waste and decadence. Except this was real, sitting in front of her, the cheese sauce still bubbling slightly from the heat. She picked up her spoon and glanced around at the other women, seeing her own confusion reflected in their faces. Adelheid was the first to taste it, driven by curiosity that overcame her caution. The moment the pasta touched her tongue, her eyes widened. It was creamy beyond anything she remembered eating, even before the war when her family had been comfortable and well-fed. The cheese was sharp and rich, the pasta perfectly cooked, the whole combination so satisfying that it seemed almost obscene. She took another bite, then another, unable to stop herself despite knowing that the other women were watching her reaction. Around the mess hall, similar scenes played out as the German prisoners encountered macaroni and cheese for the first time. Some ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if trying to memorize the taste. Others ate quickly, almost frantically, as if the food might disappear if they didn't consume it immediately. A few women began to cry, tears running down their faces as they ate, overwhelmed by the sudden confrontation with abundance after years of deprivation. Corporal Jake Morrison stood near the wall, watching the women's reactions with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something sadder, perhaps recognition of what their tears really meant. He had grown up on a ranch where food was always plentiful, where his mother made macaroni and cheese every Sunday after church. It was ordinary food to him, comfort food, nothing special. Seeing it treated as a miracle by these German women made him understand, perhaps for the first time, what the war had really cost the people on the other side. Corporal Jake Morrison had grown up on a ranch outside Cheyenne, Wyoming, where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away and conversation was measured in necessity rather than pleasure. He had learned to be patient with spooked horses, stubborn cattle, and machinery that broke down in the middle of nowhere. These skills, he discovered, translated surprisingly well to teaching basic English to German prisoners of war who were equally spooked, stubborn, and prone to breaking down when pushed too hard. He started the informal lessons during his evening guard shifts, mostly out of boredom and a genuine curiosity about the women who seemed so different from what he had expected enemy soldiers to be like. They were younger than he had imagined, many of them barely out of their teens, and they carried themselves with a rigid dignity that reminded him of colts trying to act like grown horses. The first few times he tried to engage them in conversation, they had responded with monosyllabic wariness, as if expecting a trap. But persistence was something Jake understood. He began bringing a small chalkboard from the camp schoolroom, setting it up near the barracks during the evening hours between dinner and lights out. He would write simple English words and their pronunciations, speaking slowly and using exaggerated gestures that probably made him look ridiculous but seemed to help with comprehension. Water? Bread? Good morning, thank you. Basic phrases that might make their daily existence slightly easier. Adelheid was the first to actively participate, drawn by a love of languages that she had discovered in school back in Leipzig. She had studied English before the war, though her teachers had used British pronunciation and formal grammar that sounded nothing like Jake's easy Wyoming drawl. Still, she could recognize structure and pattern, could feel her mind engaging with the puzzle of translation in a way that distracted her from the larger questions about what would happen to all of them when the war ended. She began staying after Jake's informal lessons ended, asking questions about pronunciation and grammar that he was often ill-equipped to answer. "Why do you say through but spell it that way?" she asked one evening, her frustration evident. "English makes no sense." Jake had laughed, a genuine sound that surprised both of them. "Can't argue with you there, miss. I just know it sounds right, not why it sounds right." Gradually, other women joined the evening lessons. Irmgard came partly because her signals training had included some English for understanding technical communications, but also because she was beginning to recognize that language was power, a way to understand what was really happening around them, rather than relying on filtered translations. She noticed that the Americans spoke more freely in English, assuming the German prisoners couldn't understand their casual conversations, and some of what she overheard troubled her in new ways. The Americans spoke about the war as if it were nearly over, as if Germany's defeat was inevitable and imminent. They talked about what would happen after, about going home, about rebuilding, about trials for war criminals. They spoke casually about places like Auschwitz and Dachau, names that meant nothing to Irmgard but were clearly significant. She filed these overheard fragments away, trying to piece together a picture of what the Americans knew that she did not. January 1945 brought the first mail call since the women's arrival at Camp Swift. The International Red Cross had established communication channels between prisoners and their families, though the process was slow and uncertain given Germany's collapsing infrastructure. When Captain Mitchell announced that letters had arrived, the mess hall fell into profound silence. 23 names were called, 23 women out of 47 who would receive news from home. The others sat frozen, watching as their fellow prisoners walked forward to collect thin envelopes that had traveled across an ocean. The weight of those unopened letters was visible in how carefully the women held them, as if the paper itself might disintegrate. Irmgard's name was called third. She accepted the envelope from Captain Mitchell with a quiet thank you that came out in English without conscious thought. Her mother's familiar handwriting covered the front, those loops and curves from shopping lists and birthday cards throughout her childhood. She returned to her seat, but couldn't bring herself to open it immediately, afraid of what news it might contain. Around her, other women tore into their letters with desperate urgency or carefully slit them open with borrowed knives. The sounds that filled the hall were difficult to categorize. Gasps, small wounded noises, crying, though whether from relief or grief was impossible to tell. Brunhilde opened her letter from her younger sister Katrine and felt the world tilt. The letter was dated October 19, 1944, nearly 3 months old. Katrine's handwriting was shakier than Brunhilde remembered. "Our neighborhood was hit in the bombing on September 11th, she read. "The apartment building is gone. Mama and Papa survived, but we lost everything. We're staying with Aunt Heidi in her basement. Food is very scarce. Papa's cough is worse. The doctors have no medicine." The guilt hit Brunhilde like a physical blow. She sat in an American prison camp where she had just eaten macaroni and cheese, where the infirmary had shelves of medicine, where storage rooms held more food than her family had probably seen in months. Her father was sick without medicine, while she was safe and well-fed. Irmgard finally opened her own letter with trembling hands. Her mother's words were careful, clearly written, knowing military censors would read every line. "My dear Irmgard, we received word that you were captured and are being held in America. This is better than many alternatives we feared. Your father's factory was destroyed in bombing last month, but we are unhurt. We have moved to the countryside with your aunt. Food is difficult, but we manage. Write when you can. Knowing you are alive is enough." Adelheide's letter brought worse news. Her mother's handwriting was barely legible, written in obvious haste or distress. "Your brother Klaus was killed on the Eastern Front in December. Your father died of heart failure 2 weeks later. I am alone now. The city is in ruins. I do not know what will become of us. Please come home if you can." That evening, the barracks was filled with quiet weeping. Women who had maintained military discipline for months finally broke under the weight of news from home. Irmgard lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile her mother's restrained words with the reality they described. Her childhood home was gone. Her father had no work. Her family was surviving on whatever they could find in the countryside. The camp announced in early November 1945 that the German women would participate in Thanksgiving dinner. The war in Europe had been over for months, but the women's status remained in limbo. Repatriation procedures moved slowly, complicated by chaos in occupied Germany. Captain Mitchell decided they deserved acknowledgement of their strange position, caught between countries and identities. Jake Morrison tried explaining Thanksgiving during his English lessons, struggling with concepts that had no German equivalents. "It's about being grateful," he said, gesturing broadly. "Giving thanks for harvest, survival, Being together, he paused, started with people who came to America looking for a better life. Adelheid translated for the others, but skepticism showed on many faces. What did they have to be thankful for? They were prisoners, their country defeated and occupied, families scattered or dead, futures completely uncertain. Celebrating anything seemed almost offensive. But when Thanksgiving arrived, the mess hall had been transformed. Tommy Brennan and his crew, including Brunhilde and other German women who had proven talented cooks, had worked for 2 days. The smells were unlike anything the prisoners had experienced. Roasting turkey, sweet potatoes, pumpkin pie. Each dish required extensive explanation. The tables had been arranged with Americans and Germans mixed together rather than separated. Captain Mitchell's explicit instruction, though many on both sides felt uncomfortable. Jake found himself between Adelheid and an older German woman named Elizabeth, who spoke almost no English but smiled nervously. When the food arrived, even Americans accustomed to Thanksgiving were impressed. Tommy had used his full allocation and probably called in favors. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, stuffing, green beans, cranberry sauce, sweet potato casserole, rolls, and 3 different pies. The sheer volume seemed obscene, excessive, almost aggressive in its abundance. The German women stared at their plates with expressions Jake was learning to recognize: shock, guilt, hunger, confusion about whether they deserved this, whether accepting it meant betraying something, whether the kindness was real or psychological warfare. Brunhilde looked at the sweet potato casserole with something approaching disbelief. The dish was topped with melted marshmallows, a combination so sweet and rich that it seemed to belong to fantasy rather than reality. She took a small bite, and the taste overwhelmed her. Sugar, real sugar, butter, sweetness she hadn't experienced in years. She thought about her father's cough, her family's empty cupboards, and had to set down her fork. Irmgard noticed American soldiers eating with casual efficiency, treating this abundant meal as normal, expected, perhaps even modest by their standards. This was everyday America, this excess, this waste, this casual assumption of plenty. She thought about propaganda films she had seen about American decadence and realized with bitter clarity that they hadn't been entirely wrong, just incomplete in their explanation. Adelheid ate slowly, methodically, trying each dish with the careful attention she had once given to typing reports. The turkey was moist and flavorful. The stuffing was rich with herbs and butter. The cranberry sauce provided tart contrast to the savory dishes. Each bite was a small revelation, a glimpse into a world where food was pleasure rather than mere survival. She thought about her mother alone in ruined Leipzig and felt tears building behind her eyes. Brunhilde stood in the kitchen storage room on a cold morning in late November, taking inventory of supplies as Tommy had taught her. She moved methodically down the shelves, counting cans and noting quantities in the ledger book: tomatoes, corn, beans, peaches. Each item represented abundance that seemed impossible in wartime. She paused before the dairy shelf, staring at wheels of cheese that would feed her entire family in Nuremberg for months. Tommy entered, carrying another delivery box, whistling tunelessly as he unpacked new supplies. He noticed her stillness and paused. "Something wrong?" he asked, his tone genuinely concerned despite the language barrier. Brunhilde shook her head, unable to explain in her limited English the thoughts churning through her mind. For weeks, she had been processing an uncomfortable realization. While Germany had been feeding its citizens on turnip soup and sawdust bread, while her father coughed without medicine, while her sister wrote desperate letters about starvation, Americans had been living with this. Not just adequate rations, but genuine abundance. Waste, even. She had seen kitchen scraps thrown away that would have fed families back home. The propaganda film she had watched before her capture had shown American excess as moral failure, decadence that proved capitalism's corruption. But standing in this storage room, she understood something more complex and more troubling. America hadn't been suffering under the weight of war the way Germany had. The ocean had protected them. Their cities weren't bombed. Their factories kept producing. Their farms kept yielding harvests that filled storage rooms like this one. She thought about the speeches she had heard, the rallies she had attended, the certainty she had felt that Germany was fighting for survival against enemies determined to destroy them. The leaders had spoken of American weakness, of a soft nation that would collapse under pressure. But Americans weren't weak. They were so strong, so secure, that they could afford to be generous even to their enemies. Later that afternoon, Brunhilde worked alongside Tommy preparing dinner. He showed her how Americans made something called meatloaf, mixing ground beef with breadcrumbs and eggs, shaping it into loaves that would be baked with a sweet tomato glaze. The casual use of meat, the assumption that there would be enough for everyone, struck her as almost obscene after years of rationing. Tommy noticed her troubled expression and spoke slowly, trying to help. "You okay? You look sad." His kindness made it worse somehow. He was a good man, patient and decent, teaching her skills that might help her future. But his goodness existed within a system of abundance that had been hidden from her by lies. That evening, Brunhilde sat with Irmgard and Adelheid in a quiet corner of the barracks. They spoke in low voices about what they were learning, about the uncomfortable truths accumulating around them. "We were told America was suffering," Irmgard said quietly, "that they were weak, desperate, on the verge of collapse. But they have everything. They always had everything." Adelheid nodded slowly. "What else were we told that wasn't true?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications none of them wanted to fully examine. They had built their identities on service to their country, on belief in their cause. Now those foundations were cracking. December brought genuine cold to Texas, though nothing like the brutal winters the German women had endured in Europe. Still, temperatures dropped enough that the barracks became uncomfortable at night, and several women developed coughs that worried Brunhilde with her nursing background. She reported the situation to Captain Mitchell during morning inspection, expecting little response given their status as prisoners. Instead, by that afternoon, extra wool blankets arrived from camp stores. Not threadbare or recycled military surplus, but thick, clean blankets that smelled faintly of moth prevention and storage. Private Williams, the stocky soldier who had been part of their initial guard detail, distributed them personally, making sure each woman received 2 rather than 1. "Can't have y'all freezing," he said simply, as if concern for enemy prisoners was the most natural thing in the world. The small gesture sparked something in Irmgard's mind, a memory of her signals training where she had learned to recognize patterns in seemingly random data. She began mentally cataloging the accumulating acts of kindness, the extra blankets. Tommy teaching Brunhilde to cook rather than just ordering her around. Jake spending his off-duty time teaching English. Captain Mitchell arranging for mail delivery, the generous food portions, the medical care that didn't distinguish between American and German patients. These weren't random acts of individual goodness. They represented something systematic, a policy of treating prisoners with dignity that contradicted everything she had been taught about American cruelty. She thought about German POW camps she had seen, about the casual brutality she had witnessed toward Russian prisoners, about the hierarchy of treatment based on race and nationality. The Americans weren't perfect. She had noticed tensions around the non-white soldiers, but they operated under different rules than she had known. Jake brought hot chocolate to the evening English lesson, carrying a thermos, and tin cups that he distributed to the women gathered around his makeshift chalkboard. The drink was sweet and rich, made with real chocolate and milk rather than the ersatz substitutes the German women remembered from home. Adelheid wrapped her cold hands around the warm cup and felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by this small comfort offered without expectation of anything in return. "Why are you kind to us?" she asked suddenly in careful English, the question breaking through the usual vocabulary lesson. Jake looked surprised, then thoughtful. He took his time answering, clearly trying to find words she would understand. "War's over in Europe," he said slowly. "Y'all are just people who got caught up in something bad. Being mean to you now won't fix anything that happened. Maybe being decent will help fix what comes next." He shrugged, uncomfortable with his own philosophizing. "Besides, my mama raised me to treat people right, even when it's hard." That night, Irmgard wrote in her notebook by dim light, "They are kind not from weakness, but from strength. They can afford generosity because they won. But it is more than that. They choose kindness, even when they don't have to. This is not what we were told Americans were. Either everything we learned was lies, or these particular Americans are unusual. I suspect the former." April 1945 brought spring warmth to Texas and news that changed everything. Allied forces advancing through Germany were liberating concentration camps, and American newspapers began printing photographs and accounts of what they found. Captain Mitchell left newspapers in the common room, a deliberate choice that would force the German women to confront what had been done in their country's name. Irmgard found them first. The Boston Globe, the New York Times, Stars and Stripes military newspaper. The headlines were stark. Horror beyond imagination. Allied forces liberate death camps. The photographs were grainy but clear enough. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, mass graves, barracks filled with the dying, crematorium ovens, evidence of systematic murder on a scale that seemed impossible. She sat down heavily, the newspaper trembling in her hands. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, names she had never heard before, places that apparently existed in the same Germany she had proudly served. The articles described gas chambers, medical experiments, deliberate starvation, the industrial efficiency of mass murder. She read with growing horror, part of her mind insisting this must be propaganda, Allied lies designed to justify their invasion. But the photographs were too detailed, too numerous, the accounts too consistent across multiple sources. Brunhilde found her there an hour later, tears streaming silently down her face. She picked up another newspaper and began reading. Within minutes, she had sunk into a chair beside Irmgard, her face draining of color. "This can't be real," she whispered in German. "These are lies. They must be lies." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her voice. She thought about patients who had disappeared from her hospital in Nuremberg, people labeled undesirable or defective, who had been transferred to other facilities and never mentioned again. She thought about whispered conversations among nurses that stopped when doctors entered the room. She thought about transport trains that passed through the city at night, their windows covered, their destinations unspoken. Other women gathered, drawn by Irmgard and Brunhilde's visible distress. They passed the newspapers between them, reading in horrified silence. Some began crying immediately. Others sat stunned, as if their minds couldn't process what their eyes were seeing. Adelheid stared at a photograph of children behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow and ancient despite their youth, and felt something fundamental break inside her understanding of the world. "We served this," she said quietly in German. "We worked for people who did this. We believed we were defending our country, protecting our families, serving something good, but we were part of this." The accusations weren't directed at anyone in particular, but at all of them collectively. They had worn the uniform, they had followed orders, they had believed the speeches about Germany's righteous cause. And all the while, this had been happening in camps they never knew existed, carried out by people who shared their nationality and claimed to represent their values. Captain Mitchell stood in the doorway, watching the women grapple with revelation. She had debated whether to make these newspapers available, whether forcing this confrontation was cruel or necessary. The days following the concentration camp revelations were the darkest period since the women's arrival at Camp Swift. Several refused to eat, overwhelmed by guilt that they had been well fed, while others starved deliberately. Brunhilde stopped speaking entirely for 3 days, moving through kitchen duties like a ghost. Irmgard tore pages from her diary, destroying earlier entries where she had written proudly about her service to Germany. Tommy noticed Brunhilde's silence and the mechanical way she worked, her usual careful attention replaced by hollow automation. He didn't speak German and couldn't read the newspapers that had devastated the prisoners, but he understood grief when he saw it. On the fourth day of her silence, he gently guided her to the stove where he had ingredients laid out for macaroni and cheese. "You need to remember how to make this," he said softly, speaking even though he knew she might not understand the words. "Need to know it by heart." He handed her the wooden spoon and stepped back, letting her take the lead. Brunhilde stared at the butter melting in the pan, then slowly began making the roux the way he had taught her. Flour, whisking constantly, letting it cook until golden. The familiar motions began to ground her, milk added gradually. Cheese stirred in until smooth. Tommy watched quietly, then said something that made her pause. "My grandma always said cooking for people is how you show love. Even when you can't fix what's broken, you can feed them. It's not nothing." Brunhilde understood perhaps one word in three, but his tone carried meaning beyond vocabulary. She finished the dish, and when the women came for dinner that evening, she served them herself, ladling the golden pasta into bowls with hands that shook slightly. Several women couldn't meet her eyes, but they ate. That was something. The next day, Brunhilde tentatively asked Tommy through gestures and her limited English if she could teach him a German recipe. She drew pictures of spätzle, the small egg noodles her grandmother had made every Sunday. Tommy's face lit up with understanding and interest. He gathered ingredients, and together they worked through the process, Brunhilde demonstrating how to press the batter through a colander into boiling water. Other women began drifting into the kitchen during off hours, drawn by the activity and perhaps by the need to do something constructive with their hands while their minds struggled with impossible knowledge. Margaret showed them how to make proper rye bread. Gerda demonstrated apple strudel, though American apples tasted different from German ones. Elizabeth taught them potato pancakes, explaining each step in German while Adelheid translated. Tommy welcomed them all, his kitchen becoming a space where former enemies learned from each other. He taught them biscuits and gravy, cornbread, pecan pie. They taught him sauerbraten, red cabbage, black forest cake, adapted to available ingredients. Food became their common language, a way to communicate that transcended vocabulary and history. Jake started joining the cooking sessions during his off-duty hours, claiming he wanted to learn for when he returned to the ranch. But Irmgard suspected he came because he understood what she was beginning to understand. These moments of sharing recipes and techniques were acts of rebuilding, small steps toward creating something new from the ruins of what they had been. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with mixed emotions at Camp Swift. American staff celebrated with obvious relief and joy, their voices carrying through the compound as they shared news that the war in Europe was officially over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The fighting had stopped. Their friends and brothers serving overseas would be coming home. For the German women, the announcement brought something more complex than celebration or grief. The country they had served no longer existed as they had known it. Germany was defeated, occupied, divided among the Allied powers. The government they had believed in was gone. The leaders who had commanded their loyalty were dead or captured. Everything they had built their identities upon had collapsed completely. Irmgard sat on her bunk, listening to the celebration sounds from the American quarters, and tried to imagine what came next. Repatriation would surely follow now that the war was over. They would be returned to Germany, to cities in ruins, to families scattered or dead, to a country that would need to be rebuilt from rubble and shame. The prospect should have brought relief, the promise of freedom and return home. Instead, she felt only dread. Captain Mitchell called an assembly that afternoon, her expression serious despite the celebratory atmosphere among her staff. She stood before the 47 German women and spoke clearly. waiting for Mrs. Hoffman to translate each sentence. The war in Europe is over. As prisoners of war, you will be processed for repatriation to Germany according to Geneva Convention protocols. We expect this process to begin within the next several weeks. The words were formal, official, exactly what everyone had expected, but they landed with weight that Captain Mitchell seemed to recognize. She paused, then added something that wasn't in her official statement. I know this is complicated news for all of you. Your country has been defeated, and you will be returning to very difficult circumstances. We will do everything we can to make the transition as smooth as possible. After the assembly, the women gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices about what repatriation would mean. Some expressed relief at the prospect of finally going home, of searching for surviving family members, of participating in whatever rebuilding efforts would be needed. But many others spoke with barely concealed fear about returning to a Germany they no longer recognized or understood. Brunhilde thought about her family's destroyed apartment, her father's illness, the scarcity her sister described in letters. She thought about the hospital in Nuremberg, where she had trained, wondering if it still existed or if it had been bombed to rubble. She thought about returning as a defeated soldier who had been captured and held by the enemy, about the shame and suspicion she would likely face. Adelheid thought about her mother alone in Leipzig, about her dead brother and father, about a city that had been heavily bombed. She thought about the life she might have there, sorting through ruins both literal and metaphorical, trying to build something from nothing. Then she thought about the life she had begun to imagine here, where she had discovered talents and interests she never knew she possessed. 3 weeks after VE Day, Captain Mitchell scheduled a formal meeting to announce specific repatriation procedures. The German women gathered in the mess hall on a warm May morning, dressed in the clean but worn uniforms they had maintained throughout their captivity. Most sat with military posture, backs straight and faces composed, though Irmgard could see the tension in how tightly some women gripped their hands together. Captain Mitchell stood at the front with official documents from the War Department. Her voice was steady and professional as she explained the process. Transportation has been arranged for June 15th. You will be transferred to a processing center in New York, then transported by ship to Europe. From there, you will be moved through displaced persons camps before being released to return to your home regions. The words were clear, the procedures straightforward, the timeline definite. In 3 weeks, their time at Camp Swift would end. They would leave Texas, leave the routines they had established, leave the unexpected relationships they had formed with their captors. They would return to Germany and face whatever waited for them there. Irmgard felt her heart pounding as Captain Mitchell paused. She had been discussing this moment with Brunhilde and Adelheid for days, weighing an idea that seemed impossible but increasingly necessary, now or never. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. Around her, other women turned to look with surprised expressions. Captain Mitchell, Irmgard said in careful English, her voice carrying across the silent hall. May I speak? Her accent was thick, but her words were clear, the product of months of Jake's patient teaching. The captain looked surprised but nodded. Permission granted. Irmgard took a deep breath and glanced at the women around her. Several nodded encouragingly, having agreed to support what she was about to say, even if they didn't choose it themselves. Some of us have been talking about repatriation, about Germany, about what we will return to. She paused, searching for the right English words. Some of us, we do not wish to return immediately. We wish to stay here in America if this is possible. The silence that followed was absolute. American guards exchanged shocked glances. Several German women gasped. Captain Mitchell's professional composure slipped for a moment, revealing genuine surprise. Brunhilde stood next, followed by Adelheid, then Gerda, then Margaret. 8 more women rose from their seats until 12 stood together, a visible statement of unprecedented choice. Brunhilde spoke in halting English. Germany is destroyed. Our families are scattered or dead. The country we served, we learned it was not what we believed. Here we have found something different: dignity, kindness, the possibility to become better than we were." Adelheid added her voice, her English more fluent than the others. "We know this is unusual request. We know we are prisoners, enemies, Germans who served the Reich, but we have learned here what we never knew before. We do not wish to lose this." The request sent shockwaves beyond Camp Swift's boundaries. Within days, local newspapers picked up the story with headlines ranging from "German prisoners refuse freedom" to "POWs choose Texas over homeland." The camp's telephone lines buzzed with calls from journalists, military officials, and citizens demanding to know why enemy soldiers were being allowed special consideration when American boys were still dying in the Pacific Theater. Captain Mitchell found herself defending the decision to even consider the request, writing reports to superiors in Washington while fielding questions from local authorities. The legal complications were staggering. The Geneva Convention provided for repatriation of prisoners, not for their immigration to captor nations. The women's status was unclear. Were they still prisoners of war, defeated enemy nationals, potential refugees? Each classification carried different legal implications, but alongside the criticism came unexpected support. Mrs. Hoffman, the German-American translator who had worked at the camp since the women's arrival, was the first to speak publicly in their defense. She wrote a letter to the Bastrop Advertiser describing the transformation she had witnessed. "These women arrived as enemies," she wrote. "They leave as proof that human beings can change when shown dignity and given the opportunity for redemption." Local churches began organizing meetings to discuss the situation. Pastor William Crawford of First Baptist invited several community members to hear presentations about the German women's circumstances. He had visited the camp multiple times as part of chaplain rotations and had been moved by the women's genuine remorse upon learning about concentration camps. Tommy Brennan's family surprised everyone by offering to sponsor Brunhilde. His mother, a formidable ranchwoman named Dorothy, announced at a town council meeting that any woman who could cook like Brunhilde deserved a chance at an American life. "My son tells me she works harder than anyone he's supervised," Dorothy said firmly. "War's over. Time to figure out how to live with former enemies, or we'll just fight the same wars forever." The Henderson family from Austin, who had been corresponding with Irmgard through the camp's approved mail system, offered to sponsor her as well. Mr. Henderson was a lawyer who believed he could navigate the immigration complexities. His wife Sarah, a school teacher, had been impressed by Irmgard's intelligence and her rapid English acquisition during their visits to the camp. Jake Morrison's parents, contacted by their son who wrote lengthy letters about the situation, sent a telegram offering to sponsor Adelheid at their Wyoming ranch. They needed help with bookkeeping and correspondence, and Jake had described Adelheid's clerical skills and language abilities in glowing terms. His mother added a personal note: "If our son thinks she deserves a chance, that's good enough for us." But opposition remained fierce in some quarters. The local Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter passed a resolution condemning any special treatment for German prisoners. Letters to newspapers argued that allowing former enemy soldiers to remain in America was an insult to American casualties. One editorial asked pointedly, "What message does this send to our boys who fought and died to defeat Germany?" Captain Mitchell read every letter, every editorial, every piece of correspondence that crossed her desk. The decision wasn't hers to make, ultimately. Washington would determine the women's fate based on legal precedent, diplomatic considerations, and political calculations that had little to do with individual circumstances. The response from Washington arrived on June 3, 1945, leaving less than 2 weeks before the scheduled repatriation transport. Captain Mitchell gathered all 47 women to read the official determination. Her hands were steady, but her voice carried unusual emotion as she explained the War Department's decision. "The women who wish to remain in the United States may do so," she read, "provided they can secure appropriate sponsorship, housing, and employment. Their status will be reclassified from prisoners of war to displaced persons seeking asylum. However, this reclassification means they will no longer receive housing or support from military facilities. They must leave Camp Swift by June 15th and establish independent living arrangements. The words hung in the air, offering possibility while imposing significant conditions. Staying in America meant leaving the security of the camp, venturing into communities that might welcome them or reject them, finding ways to support themselves in a country still at war with Japan and grieving its casualties. Of the 12 women who had initially requested to stay, 5 reconsidered when faced with the reality of complete independence in a foreign country. Helga, who had lost her entire family in bombing raids, decided that returning to help rebuild Germany was more important than personal comfort. Gisela and Sophia, close friends from Hamburg, chose to return together, believing they had better chances of survival supporting each other in familiar territory despite its devastation. 7 women remained committed: Irmgard, Brunhilde, Adelheid, Gerda, Margaret, Elizabeth, and a quiet radio operator named Annalisa, who had barely spoken throughout her captivity, but who had secured sponsorship from a farm family in Colorado through church connections. The women who chose repatriation didn't view those staying as traitors, nor did those staying view those returning as cowards. They understood that both groups were making impossible choices with no clear right answers. Some were returning to search for family members, to fulfill obligations to parents or siblings, to participate in rebuilding their homeland. Others were staying because they had no one to return to, or because they had found something in America worth the risk of starting completely over. The final days at Camp Swift took on a bittersweet quality. The women who were leaving helped those who were staying prepare for their new lives. They practiced English conversations, shared advice about American customs they had observed, and wrote down recipes that could serve as bridges between their old lives and new ones. Brunhilde spent hours with Tommy, learning the exact measurements and techniques for American dishes she would need to cook professionally. He wrote everything down in careful handwriting, creating a cookbook that mixed his ranch recipes with the German dishes she had taught him. "You're gonna do great," he told her. "You got talent and you got grit. That's all you need." Jake worked with Adelheid on correspondence skills, teaching her American business letter formats and typing conventions that differed from German standards. "Wyoming's different from Texas," he warned her. "Colder, more isolated, but the work's good and honest, and my folks will treat you fair." Irmgard spent evenings with the Henderson family, who visited frequently to help prepare her for life in Austin. June 1965. Brunhilde Schneider Morrison stood in her ranch kitchen outside Bastrop, Texas, watching her 15-year-old daughter Christine measure flour for spätzle. Sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked acres of grazing land where cattle moved lazily in the summer heat. On the counter, a pot of macaroni and cheese cooled beside the German noodles, 2 dishes that represented the blending of worlds that had become her life. "Why do we always make both?" Christine asked, her Texas drawl carrying no trace of her mother's German accent. "Nobody else's family eats like this," Brunhilde smiled, her English now flawless after 2 decades. "Because both are home, your grandmother's recipe and your father's favorite. We honor both." She didn't add that the macaroni and cheese still made her think of that first meal at Camp Swift, of the moment when abundance had shattered her understanding of the world. She had married Tommy Brennan in 1947, a quiet ceremony that some in the community still whispered about, but most had come to accept. Their ranch had prospered, her cooking skills combined with his ranching knowledge, creating a business that supplied beef to restaurants throughout Central Texas. She had never returned to Germany, though she sent money regularly to cousins who had survived. The telephone rang, and Christine answered it. "Mom, it's Aunt Irma." She handed over the receiver, the nickname for Irmgard, so natural that she probably didn't remember it was shortened from a different name. "Brunhilde," Irmgard's voice carried excitement. "I just received word from Adelheid. She's being honored by the Wyoming Historical Society for her work documenting immigrant experiences. They're doing a whole exhibition about post-war immigration. Irmgard had become a translator and advocate for displaced persons in Austin, her language skills and personal experience making her invaluable to refugees navigating American bureaucracy. She had married an American lawyer and had 3 children who spoke no German but understood their mother's complex history. The 7 women who had stayed in touch constantly, a network of shared experience that few others could understand. They gathered annually, taking turns hosting, their American families mixing with growing ease. Gerda had become a teacher in Houston. Margaret ran a bakery in San Antonio. Elizabeth had moved to California and worked in a hospital. Annalise raised sheep in Colorado with her farming family. They spoke often about the women who had returned to Germany, maintaining correspondence that had been difficult during the occupation years, but had grown easier as West Germany rebuilt and reconciled. Several of those women had become leaders in German-American friendship organizations, using their experiences at Camp Swift to build bridges between former enemies. Brunhilde finished the call and returned to cooking with Christine, teaching her daughter the careful technique of pressing spätzle dough through the press into boiling water. She thought about her father, who had died in 1946 before she could send him medicine. She thought about her sister Katrine, who had rebuilt a life in Munich and whose children she knew only through photographs. "Tell me again about the camp," Christine said, as she often did, hungry for stories of her mother's past.